This is how Planetside is being played right now. This is what the casual player base of Planetside is doing in their day-to-day gameplay after coming home from work and trying to relax. I'm gonna make a bold prediction and say that they won't be doing it for that much longer, because it's only fun as long as you're getting those dopamine-inducing little XP ticks and certs. Like in the last few videos, I want to untangle all the messy mechanics that have brought us to this point and see if we can find a solution. Planetside 2 is a game made for fights at an epic scale and massive amounts of players, but more doesn't always equal better. In the last few years, a majority of the Planetside experience has condensed into seemingly never-ending fights at the middle base of their respective continent. I want to dig into how we got to that point, why that even is a bad thing, and how we can both spread out fights over the entire continent again, and turn those middle bases into a more fluid experience. So which bases am I even talking about? The three prime examples are the Crown, Nathan's Defiance, and the Ascent. SME's middle base, Isotech doesn't usually play out the same as those other three, but there are similar phenomena in Waterson's and Echo Valley Substation. I'm not going to cover OSHA's middle base, Excavion cleanup site, as it deals with a bunch of other problems that aren't related to this video's topic. But before we even get to what's problematic with those bases, I want to find out why we have these hour-long fights at them that can sometimes last the entire duration of the continent. Some of you are going to say, of course, everyone goes to the middle, it's the only option. And you're correct, that's exactly the problem. While the Unstable Warpgate system is a great idea when it actually is off hours, it makes for a significant problem when there are more than enough players. The way it works is that the continent starts with only one lane unlocked. The population is then checked every 60 seconds. Once it hits 100 players, the secondary state with 2 lanes is unlocked, and once it hits 350 players, the entire continent is unlocked. That means even in the very best case, the continent will remain restricted for 1 minute upon becoming playable. Now when an alert ends and the current continent locks, players will stay on that continent for a bit, playing out their lives, finishing fights, killing leftover vehicles, the usual. That kind of stuff can take a minute or maybe 2 for roughly half the players at the end of the alert. People also log off after an alert as it's just a good natural stopping point, or maybe because they don't like the next continent too much. So let's take all of that into account and assume a number of around 800 players based on recent peaks in Planetside most popular servers. I'll put down a very generous 10% for players that log off after an alert. If it's the end of a primetime alert, this could easily be more. And then half those people kinda stay on the continent to mess around, they get a snack or go to the restroom, you know, like normal human beings. And we're barely above the threshold to fully open the continent. Of course, none of these numbers are instant, it's all players trickling in over time, so we can say that at primetime it takes 2 to 3 minutes for the continent to fully unlock. With how the current population numbers are looking, even at slightly less populous times, things can therefore take 5 or 6 minutes until the continent is all the way unlocked. Obviously nobody wants to wait out these few minutes until the continent is fully playable. They will pull asunder and drive to the closest enemy base, taking the path that is once again the most convenient and quick, bringing them to the middle base of their respective continent. That is also the reason why Isotech does not get any action right away. The closest bases to deploy Thunderers at are Echo Valley, Pale Canyon and Rime Analytics. Before the Unstable Warpgate system, the continent would unlock in full and players would immediately spread out more. Let's take a specific example that I don't have any evidence for because it was over 6 years ago, but you'll just have to trust me here. When Ambush would unlock, the first base players would usually go to is Chimney Valley, just because it's easier to drive a Sunday to it from Heoka Chemical instead of driving up a hill somewhere to the Ascent or basically any other place in the entire continent. From there the map would be in a much more natural state as Chimney Valley either gets defended or captured fully and players would move on to another base. Reason number 2 is join combat, formerly known as instant action. The mechanics behind it are that you will drop on the fight with the highest allied population. Unless you are at that fight already, then it'll be the second most allied populated fight. The only exceptions I've found so far are join combat dropping you on middle bases that have some kind of fight but low allied pop. Surprisingly, that's all there is to instant action. I spent way too much time investigating this, almost in hopes that it'd be more interesting, but if you want to confirm things for yourself, Just stand in the Warpgate and press the button over and over. I'll get to what that means for our middle bases later, but I'm sure you can figure out where it might lead to problems. These are the two main causes of players unconsciously ending up at the middle bases. There's obviously also players that will intentionally go to middle bases and place Sundras on there because they love to sit the choke points and spam their thumpers or rest tools. Unfortunately, this all culminates in the never-ending middle base fights that we have right now. Now, why is everyone bunching up at the middle base a problem? Let's look at it in terms of map movement and flow first. I'll take a very common occurrence on Indar involving the Crown as an example. Both the Crown and TR allies will have relatively high population numbers on them, with a lot of players not really doing much. The obvious result is that the rest of the map is lacking fights. An important piece of context here is that a decent chunk of the player base doesn't start fights by themselves. They will use redeploy or join combat to go from fight to fight. Additionally, the spawn system will prefer showing players defensive spawns over offensive spawns. When anyone tries to start a fight at any other base, the players at Crown or TR allies will naturally redeploy to defend said base, and a joint combat flag might appear for it. Because of that flag and an inherent bias for defending in the game, the players trying to recapture the point will quickly gain overpop on the base, shut down spawns, and therefore end the fight in a matter of a few minutes. Sometimes much less if somebody decides to spawn a Viper Lightning and blast down the Sunday early. After the fight, players will once again redeploy or press join combat, and where does it bring them? Back to the middle base. It will look like a fight on the map because there's high enemy pop within the hex or a hex nearby, but once you spawn there, all you see is two groups of players staring across a road. Join combat obviously brings you right back to the middle fight, either way, as it will keep having the highest ally pop on the continent. What we end up with is a map state that will very rarely change, making for stale fights in the exact same spots. One of Planetside 2's other massive strengths is the sheer amount of bases that you get to fight on. Even as you're going up to triple digits of hours spent in the game, there are still a lot of places to explore and learn how to play in. If you're forced to repeat the same fights at the same 4 or 5 bases every day, the game will get boring a lot faster than it has any right to be. What about the bases themselves though? There doesn't necessarily have to be a problem, they're all relatively big and can probably hold the highest amount of player counts when it comes to singular bases. The thing is that players don't perfectly spread out to every playable area that is offered. As I've explained in the recent few videos talking about the game, an average player will take the path of the least resistance, but in this instance it's more like the path of the least inconvenience, which means they will go from spawn point to the first piece of action they can get. And even that is technically all good. It's natural that players will want to have the smallest amount of downtime after dying. The problem starts in the base design at these middle bases. Very tight corridors, small tunnels or door frames as the only way to a new area. Places that are easy to hold defensively in both directions. Inevitably a fight will evolve in a way that one of these places is the most convenient place to go to and quote-unquote play the game. Which gets us to the dreaded main point of this video, the choke point. Let's take the Ascent as an example base. Here's a top down of the base with the two most common Sunday spots. I've roughly filled in the most common paths to take in the cave section. Assuming that a point is captured by either of the attackers, the most straightforward way to another point and more fights are these two paths. Two sizable groups of players meet at this tiny tunnel that is maybe 3 or 4 player models wide. Expectedly, this is where all the movement stops, as grenade and all the other funny explosive weapons get pretty much guaranteed hits because the tunnel is as wide as the outer blast radius of those weapons. The same obviously happens with the Northern Sundra. I'm sure you've all seen it before, I don't need to describe how difficult it is to get out of those tunnels, especially when hash tanks are looking into those holes from the defender side. Alternative options aren't much better here, disregarding the fact that most players will not take them out of laziness. The southern route ends up in a pretty open area that you can easily get picked off in, and the northern option often gets shut down by vehicles before getting up the slope is possible. Even when you do make it that far, there are too many angles to deal with and enemy players have a massive height advantage on you. Nason's Defiance and the Crown have similar spots that players will inevitably end up in, namely the tunnel section right under the spawn room and the stair entrances to the Crown underrun sections. These 3 bases are going to be my main examples for the rest of the video to explain the most egregious choke points and how to somewhat make them flow better. Why don't we dig into exactly what the issues are so we can attempt to fix them. Number 1. Tight spaces make for extremely effective explosives. All 3 of the choke points have less width than the outer blast radius of a standard frag grenade, and maybe double of the outer blast radius of the thumper. If you want to get away from an explosion, you have to back up and wait, something you'll have to do multiple times a minute. Number 2. Complete lack of alternate angles. When you peek a corner, it'll be the only corner there is, and at least 3 people will be looking at you, potentially preferring the corner with a thumper. You might get away with trading a kill, but no progress is ever gonna be made on either side. The next 3 points are specific to unique types of choke points, and they are definitely the most apparent at the 3 bases we're covering, but they can also apply to choke points at other areas in the game. For Nathan's Defiance, preventing excessive double teaming in a T-junction. Nathan's has a problem with all 3 factions meeting at this tiny T-junction. Attempting to make space towards one of the factions will always result in being punished by the other one, locking 3 groups of players in place unless things get resolved by sizable flanks. For the Crown, head glitching as a result of differing heights. The height differences at the Crown make it so that pushing through the tunnel stairs is difficult, as you're either getting head glitched by enemy players above you, or other players will see your feet before you get to shoot them when they're below you. For the Ascent, hash spam denying space. Tanks or any other vehicle can shoot right into the choke point that attackers will be coming out of. Usually choke points eventually get resolved when one side builds up a critical mass of players that can't be stopped anymore. With one hash lightning shooting into the tunnel, it sometimes isn't possible for attackers to push out, even if they have triple the numbers of the other side. We identified all the major problems, so let's try to fix them while reworking all 3 of those locations. To actually do that, I loaded all the relevant Planetside assets into Unreal Engine and rebuilt the 3 choke points in question, trying to stay within the physical and aesthetic limitations of each base. Obviously this isn't a perfect recreation, and I'm only focusing on the choke point section of every base, so things might look ugly or not quite like the original here and there. I'm also using some general level design philosophies that are very nicely explained in this video, which is linked in the description. Let's begin with Nathan's Defiance. Obviously, first of all, I widened the tunnels. There's space to dodge grenades now and still fight a player from a different angle, massively alleviating issue number 1. I also added more boxes and head glitches to stand on, making it easier to avoid AoE damage spam. The widening and addition of new cover pieces also helps with splitting up fights into multiple 1v1s, instead of having to peek into literally everyone you're fighting, and encourages more aggressive plays, as the players don't need to expose themselves for very long to get to the next piece of cover. I tried to give every faction their own little lane to fight in, but also give opportunities for players to interact with the other 2 factions at once. For example, this stack of boxes overlooking the whole area, and some opportunities to backstab a group of players that might just be busy with the 3rd faction. It's obviously hard to tell whether this really works. It'll need playtesting and some adjustments based on that. On first glance, there's a lot of potential C4 multi-kills when chucking it over the big boxes, and the box head glitch below them might turn out too strong, but I'll gladly take that over no potential for any multi-kills in the current iteration. And if you're thinking, man, he really just made a room with a shit ton of boxes in it, how lame? Then let me tell you this. It's a shipping area for Nathans where they receive all their supplies and guns and stuff. Here's a little terminal to keep inventory, here's a shelf with some shit in it, and these posts totally retract down when a driver comes in. Boom, lore. Also, every base just has a lot of boxes in it. That's how cover design works in Planetside. I try to keep it very simple in all 3 of these examples, just to get the point across as best as I can. For the Ascent tunnel, I once again widened everything and gave multiple options to approach fights from. Players can advance by going from cover to cover, and I've placed the rocks in a way that you won't get fully shut down by crossfires once you enter the cave. The more important part is the other side of the tunnel though. First of all, I want to shut down any hash spam going right into the cave entrance. So I've added another big box to prevent lightnings or other tanks from driving up and essentially head glitching this ramp. I also duplicated the bridge overhang cover, moved the tree a little bit, and added a much needed lamp to deny tanks from moving onto the bridge altogether. There's also these little roadblocks to eliminate vision into the tunnel from below and give extra cover. I can see some concerns about tanks shooting into the cave from further away and Harris's driving into it, but that is much easier to fix with in-game playtesting, so I won't bother with it here. I'll keep things simple for the crown. Like everywhere else, let's start with doubling the width of the stairs. Next up is a platform in between, making the run up the stairs less daunting and somewhat counteracting the height advantage or free vision from below defenders can get. I also added a second set of stairs, opening up another way to at least get halfway there, and have a closer angle to support allies running all the way up. This one shouldn't have the same problem the current stairs have, as it's shorter, and players holding it can easily get flushed out by grenade spam. Nothing crazy here, just a bit more space and an alternate path should be enough to make things flow better. We've somewhat resolved stalemates in our 3 examples, but the game still drags players to the middle bases for no reason. Let's take a look at joint combat and the Unstable Warpgate system to try and balance out fights across the entire continent. Joint combat needs to do literally anything else. Prioritize overall highest population fights, prioritize most underpopped fights, prioritize highest enemy population in a contested area, ideally even something more nuanced that can statistically create more balanced fights and varied bases to fight at. Joint combat is such a widely used mechanic that it's worth spending a lot of time improving on it. It requires collecting a lot of data to create the most ideal version, not something I'm able to do, but I'm very certain it would be worth the time spent. The problem with the Unstable Warpgate system is that it will never fully unlock the continent right away. At a certain population number, the continent is guaranteed to unlock after 1 or 2 minutes, so just instantly unlocking the continent can avoid players making their way to the middle base immediately. Let's say right as the continent locks, the global server population is checked. If it's above 500, the next continent fully unlocks right away. This accounts for players logging off or taking a while to leave the locked continent. The Unstable Warpgate still stays in place for off hours, and when it is not needed, there's a more seamless transition to the next continent. Another solution would be to slightly expand the active bases in the one-lane format like they are on Asamir. This might lead to choke points forming at different bases, but we should still end up with a more tolerable map flow. Putting all that together, we can provide a more varied experience in terms of what bases are being played. Especially newer players are entirely at the mercy of where the in-game mechanics direct them, as they don't know how to properly select fights themselves. I'm gonna go ahead and say that not having them sit at the same fight for 2 hours might be more fun. But even if they do end up in the middle fight for 2 hours, they won't have to sit at the exact same place, since choke points resolve faster with the new designs. For the record, I don't dislike the entirety of every middle base, excluding the performance problems due to an overabundance of construction assets and players. They can be very enjoyable. But I'd love to get the perspective of someone that likes sitting in those choke points for hours on end, maybe even spamming their thumper. Is it genuinely exciting, or is it just the impression of gameplay while you're maybe watching a movie on the side? Feel free to comment on that and the choke point redesigns. I had a good amount of fun making them, so I might look into doing more of that if it's something you guys enjoyed seeing. I also made a Ko-fi, so if you really want to give me some money without Twitch siphoning off of it, now you can. It's kinda like Patreon, but better from what I've seen. Anyways, I'll see you for the next video, probably when an actual real Planetside update comes out. Surely that'll happen any day now.